Well, welcome back. Hope you got a chance to watch my other videos, and please subscribe if you are not subscribed. But today's title is Why Did Jonah Run? And this is a kind of interesting one, because if you look at Jonah, you know, he had a huge assignment from God, going to this massive city at the time and teaching, you know, having the people repent. And that's what people think about, that he was just a selfish guy, and he was just a, you know, I think they people look at it a little bit on the surface of what really happened. And so I'll look at a couple different reasons of why Jonah did run. I think the lesser reason he ran was that he was just terrified or afraid. And so he runs to the furthest known place at the time in the Mediterranean world, which was Tarshish, which even sounds a little far, but it was in southern Spain, so it was really the furthest place he can go to. And give you a little background here. Before Jonah had run, there was a prophet Elijah, and maybe 100 or 200 years earlier. And Elijah goes and he kills, this is the famous thing where he kills 450 false prophets with a crowd of Israelites. And then Jezebel threatens to kill him. In the next 24 hours, he's like, within a day, I'm going to kill you. And so maybe, you know, he's also a little remorseful for killing 450 of these false prophets, probably a little traumatized. And, you know, he's human as well. And so basically at the time, there was all this immorality in the kingdom of Israel. There was a lot of wealth and a lot of corruption, a lot of, you know, bad things going on. Baal worship and stuff like that, where they sacrificed their children, had gotten really bad. So Elijah runs in panic, and he goes to the furthest place in Judah, the southern Judah, to run away from Jezebel. And you can read about that in 1 Kings chapter 19. And, you know, almost to the point where he goes into Egypt. And then he finally asks God to die. He's like, I'm just no better than anyone else. I just want to die, God. And Jonah, almost in the same way, does the same thing. And if you look at, you know, I can give you some examples of why I think Jonah was just in total fear. And the city of Nineveh, which was the Assyrian, like an Assyrian capital, they had basically conquered a whole bunch of people. And they record their conquering on tablets of the things they would do to people after they conquered them. And they would do nice things like, you know, skin people alive, impale people on poles, blind people, and they would have very harsh penalties for homosexuality and adultery. And, you know, they would basically treat their conquered women, the slaves, very badly. And it was a very kind of militarized, they had a lot of advancements in their military at the time. And so Jonah was called to go and save these people. If you can imagine, after some of those things they had done to people, their conquered people, God calls him and he says, you need to go to Nineveh and save those people. And so I think that's the first reason. He was just afraid. I mean, terrified of going to this nation and what they did to people. And but I think the bigger reason is that he was just sentimental. You know, he had a lot of sentimentality towards the people that he lived with, and he was from Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel. And if you read the books of Amos and Hosea, they were the prophets a little bit before Jonah, but at the same time. They kind of prophesied at the time of when Jonah was called to go. Now, the difference was Amos and Hosea, they prophesied to Israel, the northern king only, and they stayed there, or to Judah. But God called Jonah to actually go to Nineveh to save the Ninevites, which is really saving the Assyrian Empire. And he gets them to repent, right? So you know the story of at least what was generally done. So anyways, if you read about Amos and Hosea, they basically spoke a lot about the kingdom of Israel. They preached against it, and they talked a lot about the what was going on there at the time. And at this time, Israel was kind of very financially prosperous. They become very greedy. There was a lot of rampant immorality and corruption, kind of like the United States today, or things going on in our country in many ways. And in Amos chapter 6, verse 4, it says that the people were so wealthy in Israel that their beds were made of ivory, which is like obviously the trunks of elephants. So they had gotten so much money that they were that wealthy. And in Amos chapter 2, it talks about temple prostitution, basically the places of worship, like in Bethany, which was a famous place, a historical place for Israel. They were basically committing prostitution at the Lord's temple, and you can also read in Hosea chapter 4. It talks a lot about that, and the different forms of prostitution at their temple and all that stuff, the immorality, and actually God even mocks the name Bethany, calls it Beth Aven, which is like a derogatory term for the town. This really holy private town that was in northern kingdom Israel from the time of Jacob. Actually, it was a holy place, but they pretty much ruined the thing. And so in Hosea chapter 11, he says that now this is 50 years before Assyria destroys the northern kingdom of Israel, in Samaria in particular. And he says, Assyria shall be your king because they refuse to come to me. So I had mentioned some things about Assyria and what they had done to people. And, so that's what, God was really trying to get them to change, but they kind of resisted. They were really stubborn and didn't want to do with what God said. And it wasn't the fact that, some people think, well, Assyria was just this powerful army. Well, Assyria, at the time, Judah was still following God. They're still doing what God, in many ways, had asked them to do. And so God spared them. You can read all about that. I think it was in Chronicles, where it talks about how miraculously God saved Hezekiah from sure disaster. And then he had, temporarily destroyed the king and sent him back, and he got assassinated and all that stuff. And had done a miracle, really, for Hezekiah because he was humble to God. And so really the whole story is that Jonah, and we'll read about it in a second, but Jonah wanted a serious punishment, and not his friends, not the people, his tribe in Israel, the people of Israel. So he kind of had this, he went against God, and basically he didn't want the Assyrians. He thought they were bad people, and he didn't want them to punish his friends, the supposed children of God. And, so he had this kind of bitter heart posture towards, because of sentimentality. And the last thing one of the scriptures I want to share about from Amos was in Amos chapter 9, verse 3. It says, even if they hide from my sight at the bottom of the sea, I will command the serpent to bite them. And this is so prophetic, but this is basically Amos saying, even if people go to the bottom of the sea, that the Lord's going to basically discipline them. He calls them bite them. And that's exactly what happened to Jonah, which is really funny that he prophesied, and then Jonah runs away tries to get away to the furthest place on the earth from Israel or from Nineveh. Nineveh was completely opposite direction. And he basically has him swallowed by a fish or a whale or whatever the biblical equivalent of that was. And then he basically bites him in the sense of he rebukes him, in the belly of this serpent, right? So so I'm gonna take a look in Jonah, and I want to just really read a few things from there real quickly. But so in the beginning of Jonah, it talks about how Jonah chapter 1, it says, starting verse 1, it says, now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare, those names hard to pronounce, and went down into it, and to go with them into Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. The mariners were afraid, each cried out to his God, and they hurled a cargo into the ship into the sea and lightened it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and lay down and was fast asleep. So Jonah was overwhelmed that he just went back. He was so overwhelmed, I think. He was out of guilt as well. And he goes to sleep, It's kind of like when you're so overwhelmed, you're just tired and you want to go to sleep. So the captain came to him and said, what do you mean to go, you sleeper? Arise to call on your God. Perhaps the God will give you thought to us, perhaps, and that we may not perish. Okay, so Jonah goes, and the ship's about to break apart. And if you're listening, I would assume that God has chosen you or called you to do something. Because most people that get these kind of, that watch these videos, that God has called you to do something, or that God is calling you to change, and that He has a purpose that's much, much deeper for you. And that this calling might be really scary or feel really uncomfortable. You might have to go against your family, your fake friends, or religious groups, or church, or your job, people at your job, because you know that these things that are going on there are against what God is telling you. And you can clearly see it. It's very evident to you, but maybe you want to run from it, or not, run from God's calling and not go to God. And I think in my life, I got to a point in my life where I saw things in a group I was a part of many years ago. And basically, I felt like I made a deal with God. I felt like I just, God made this thing where I said, God, I don't want to be a part of this. And if you help me to get out of this, I'll do whatever you say, God. I will, however bad it is, I will hold to the truth, and I will do whatever it is that you want me to do, God. And God took me out of the situation and really helped me many times to kind of get out of bad situations in my life where I was like, I don't want to be this bad person. I don't want to be this person that's hurting people. I don't want to be this person that's taking part of the things that are going on here. And from that day on, God kind of would do things to, first of all, to heal me, and secondly, to get me out of situations that maybe weren't the best. And that's kind of how it's been the last, 4 or 5 years in my life, even though it's been hard, So let's pick up in Jonah chapter 1, verse. Again, my Bible's flipping here. In Jonah chapter 1, and starting in verse 7, it says, "And they said to one another, 'Come, let us cast lots, so we know on whose account this evil has come upon us.' So they cast lots, and the lot fell to Jonah. Then they said to him, 'Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country, and what people are you of?' And he said to them, 'I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land.' Then the men were exceedingly afraid, and said to him, 'What is this that you have done?' For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he told them. Then they said to him, 'What shall we do to you, that the sea may quiet down for us?' The sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, 'Pick me up and hurl me into the sea, that the sea may quiet down for you. For I know it is because of this great tempest has come upon you.' Nevertheless, men rowed hard towards back to dry land, and they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, 'O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as you had pleased.' So they picked up Jonah, and they hurled him into the sea. And the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows." See, even Jonah's running. I mean, Jonah had ran so far, everything to go against the Lord, and to go into his feelings, into his fears, into all these things that he was doing to flee from the Lord's will. And he flees, and finally gets to the point where they throw him into the waves, and you can imagine how bad they felt. But as soon as they did it, the sea calmed down, and they were able to go on their way. And then Jonah, the Lord does such a miraculous thing. And Jonah, basically, I'm sure he felt so despondent at this point that basically was just thrown into the sea. He was going to drown for sure. But here's what God does. Out of all this insane things going around him, Jonah finally, well, in a sense, he humbled himself. Now he finally obeys the Lord, and he throws him into the sea. And you can imagine his feeling at this point. He throws him into the sea, and there a fish comes and basically swallows him up. So Jonah's in this dark place for 3 days, and humbled to the core, just like Amos Red predicted. And finally Jonah gets to the point where he humbles out. He's in this belly of this whale or fish for 3 days. And then he decides to say, okay, I'm going to go back to God. I'm going to do what God had asked me to do, and then God basically spits the fish out. The fish spits him out. And, that he's not in a panic anymore. God, he finally takes him. And I think God got me to the point where I finally just said to God, okay, God, whatever it is that you want, but it got a point where in my life, and I finally had peace in my life, even in these crazy circumstances. And I'll tell the story in a later video, but basically I was in a place where God, I had peace. I had peace where I said, I know, God, you're working. I was doing my own thing, and I was about to spend a couple weeks in another country, to go away and just to basically, to do whatever I felt like I wanted to do. And then God took me and put me in the belly of a whale in a sense of, I was arrested by the FBI, but put me in the belly of a whale for 3 days. So I was basically in federal prison for a weekend, and for, I think it was 3 or 4 days or something like that. And God humbled me, and I had peace. I really had peace at that point, which is really interesting. And so, and then the rest of the story is, the story is that he goes on, the fish spits him out. He gets on dry land and he goes back to God. He corrects. At least he's humble enough to go back to God, to do whatever God asked him to do. And so he goes and he preaches to the city of Nineveh. And the last part of this, you can imagine that, okay, he gets them to repent. And Nineveh became the city that, the Assyrians come, and they 50 years later they attacked, as Amos and predicted, and basically they attack the city, they attack the northern, and they just completely destroy northern Israel, carry off their king and all that stuff. But the great thing about, if there's a saving grace of all this stuff, is that from this valley of Jezreel, which is where where Jonah actually grew up, is where Jesus eventually comes from. So these three people, Hosea, Amos, and then Jonah and Micaiah, which is the prophet Micah, and even later is Isaiah, they speak of the Lord's coming. They speak of Jesus' coming, and he comes out of the valley of Jezreel, where all this was destroyed, and all these people. And in their books, they actually speak about the coming of Jesus that was going to deliver his people later on. And the amazing thing is that Jesus actually grew up only 2 miles away from Jonah, where Jonah's birthplace was. And many people think that his tomb was there as well. Although some people think it was actually in Nineveh. There's two different stories going of where Jonah actually died and was buried. And but many church historians, actually early church historians, said his tomb was actually where Jonah was born, in this area. So, which is really, and I wonder if Jesus as a child, I wonder if his parents actually took him, because Jesus grew up in Nazareth, which is 2 miles away from where Jonah was from. And I wonder if his parents would take him there. It's just really curious. So I don't know if that's actually happened or not, but we don't know. But Gath Hepher was where Jonah was born. So very interesting story. I wonder if he actually took him there. If they took him there as a child. When I was a child, my parents took me. I lived near Niagara Falls, so they would always take, anytime anybody would come to visit me, uncles or cousins or anybody, we would go take them, or anybody special that came to visit the family. We would go take them to Niagara Falls. It was a thing to do. It was like, hey, they came. So so I probably saw Niagara Falls maybe 100 times as a child. And but it still kind of holds a special place in my heart, I guess. But anyway, so that's the story of Jonah. And for yourself, if you're listening, I hope that you have taken something from this, and that whatever God has you to do, whatever His plan for you, and what you are chosen to do, what His purpose for you. I hope that you can listen to the story and understand that, God, many times that God wants us to do things, and they seem very difficult. They seem like, wow, I'm going against traditions, I'm going against people or fake friends or whatever. And, I have to basically speak against what certain people are doing. But the great thing is that God gives you the ability to do it. And if he chose you, he's going to give you the ability to do it. He's going to bless you on the other side of that. So I hope that can encourage you. And many people, you can say Jonah was even a little bitter at the end, but the thing was, it accomplished God's purpose. And even Jesus referred to Jonah and later on, and then he talks about how Jonah, he used his example of Jonah, what Jonah went through, is that Jesus was in the earth for 3 days, so he even used Jonah later on to reference him, which is pretty amazing. The whole thing is a miracle, quite honestly, in how God saved Jonah from sheer disaster, from sheer death. So I hope this encourages you. I hope this encourages you to be bold and brave and to do whatever God